a teetotal, non-smoking Christian scientist who, for some curious reason, takes to Bukowski's work, even though it's all about drinking and sex and sort of a miserable, depressive, dead-end life. And he starts a company, a publishing company called Black Sparrow Press, to publish Bukowski.
With Martin's Black Sparrow Press behind him, Bukowski soon rose to prominence in the 1970s as a distinctive outsider author. Along with the publication of his autobiographical novels Post Office, Factotum, and Women, he traveled the country attending public poetry readings and gained notoriety as an enfant terrible of the literary world.
Do I know you? One more beer. I'll take you all of you.
And despite his image as a hard-drinking misanthropist, his writing was celebrated for its candor and dark wit.
He writes about work, and he writes about the experiences of the American working class, which is really one of his really distinctive things. He doesn't write about the experience of being a successful American, which is the stuff of most American art and literature, certainly. He writes about being a working class, what really people would now call the underclass. He writes about sex, he writes about drinking, and he writes in a broader way about, in an existential way, about being a sort of lonely soul in modern America, really, without much faith, without anybody to rely upon apart from himself, sort of drifting through life and trying to make sense of life.
It's not the large things that send a man to a madhouse. Death he's ready for, or murder, incest, robbery, fire, flood. No, it's a continuing series of small tragedies that send a man to the madhouse. Not the death of his love, but a shoelace that snaps with no time left. With each broken shoelace, out of 100 broken shoelaces, one man, one woman, one thing enters a madhouse. So be careful when you bend over.
Although he was a misanthrope and a loner, there is this sort of feeling for his common man. I don't really think he necessarily wanted to meet his common man, but he liked them at a distance, you know. He didn't, if you went into a bar, he'd more often than not get into a fight. And he lived alone. He didn't have many friends, but I think at a distance he had a lot of feeling for people who worked in factories and parked the cars and served behind the bar and all the rest of it.
And it was this vision of a marginalized America that attracted Tom Waits to Bukowski's work. Taking influence from a wide variety of artistic channels, as with Kerouac, Bukowski's prose and poetry were as inspiring to Waits as the music he was absorbing in the early 70s.
Tom had this big, long, vintage Cadillac, four-door sedan, black vintage Cadillac four-door sedan. And he read all these newspapers and books, and they all ended, I mean, you just had a vision of him finishing it and tossing it in the back seat, because they all ended up in the back seat of that car. And if you ever saw that car in the parking lot, it was filled with newspapers and paperback books, and so the back seat was just piled high with this stuff. He was constantly trying to move himself along on that literary road as well as the musical road. And I think that you find these influences along the road, and you see how he incorporates them into his music, and you see what comes out the other side. You know, it kind of goes through the Tom Waits mill and comes out something completely different, you know.
You know, my dad spent a lot of time in the bars, so I was drawn to places like that, dark places. My dad drank in the afternoon in really dark bars, and so I guess that's how it began. And of course, it's much more than that. But the place that I hooked into him was the fact that he was seemed to be a writer of the common people and street people, and looking in the corners of the dark corners where no one seems to want to go, and certainly not write about. And so, yeah, he seemed like he was the writer for the dispossessed and the people who didn't have a voice.
He discovered Bukowski through his columns in an underground LA magazine, and that was where he first heard his voice. And he just liked the idea of this, cantankerous misfit You know, writing in such a sort of raw, naked way about his life and his past and his experience. You know, there was just no bullshit there at all. He just this almost terrifying honesty.
Your life is your life. Don't let it be clubbed into dank submission. Be on the watch. There are ways out. There is light somewhere. It may not be much light, but it beats the darkness. Be on the watch. The gods will offer you chances. Know them and take them. You can't beat death, but you can beat death in life. Sometimes the more often you learn to do it, the more light there will be. Your life is your life. Know it while you have it. You are marvelous, and the gods wait to delight in you.
One sees a lot of Bukowski in Waits. I mean, whether it came from Bukowski, I don't know. But I mean, the writing about place, of course, is the same, both writing about Hollywood and writing about East Hollywood, basically, not the fancy West Hollywood where all the actors and journalists and movie people live, but East Hollywood where the waitresses and the mechanics and the security guards live. That's what they both wrote about. They also wrote about marginalized people on the skids. They seem to wallow in this sort of melancholy end of the road feeling.
But what becomes of little boys who never comb their hair? They're lined up all around the block. They're on the nickel and over there.
If you look at Bukowski's influence on Tom, I mean, I think a clear example would be the song On the Nickel, which is specifically about Skid Row in Los Angeles. So he's moving right into Bukowski territory after being familiar with his work for a long time. And it is about what happened to the little boys who didn't comb their hair. You know, what happens to these people? And there's sort of an openness to examining those lives that's common to both Bukowski and Tom Waits. Tom is more tender towards those people, and I think Bukowski is a darker, slightly more cynical view of that universe, and yet they're still looking at the same people. I think Tom is just a little more open to it, but I think he also sees that in Bukowski. I mean, you know, in the recording that he did on Orphans Nirvana, you know, it's the warmer side of Bukowski that he's embracing and emphasizing. So he's not exactly channeling Bukowski's vision, but he certainly saw something there that was common to his own sensibility and that he liked and I think drew from.
Waits was always interested in people who just were excluded by society, and that included drunks. You know, a lot of drunks. You know, Bukowski was not a Skid Row bum per se, but he'd lived in Skid Row flop houses, and he was just writing about what it was like to be in that place, to just have no status in the America of the 50s and 60s and even the 70s when he was starting to make quite a good living.
Tom Waits' lyrics are very, very good, you know, and they're rather light poems. They're rather like Bukowski poems. And one would have thought if he'd sat down and listened to them, looked at them, he would have enjoyed them. And he would have seen some of himself in them and couldn't help but be flattered. But whether he ever took the trouble, I very much doubt.
Outside